I was always the forgotten son, until my parents gave my inheritance to my brother and I decided to make them regret it. Hey, Reddit. I'm not usually one to air my dirty laundry online, but after everything that's happened with my family, I can't keep it inside anymore. This isn't just your run-of-the-mill family drama. It's a story of favoritism, betrayal, and finally getting even when you're treated like disposable property. Buckle up, because this ride is long, messy, and frankly infuriating. I grew up as the less important son. My name is Daniel, I'm 27 years old, and I have an older brother, James, who's 32. For as long as I can remember, James was the apple of my mom's eye. It wasn't even subtle. While he got everything handed to him on a silver platter, I was expected to fend for myself. My dad was mostly silent on the matter. He rarely objected to my mom's decisions, so I learned to accept that I'd always be the independent one who never needed much help. Looking back, there were so many moments that stung. When James turned 16, he got a brand new car, a sleek, shiny ride that he paraded around town with pride. Meanwhile, I saved for months just to scrape together enough money for a beat-up used car. Every time I asked for something, the answer was always the same. We can't afford that right now, or James needs it more. I remember a birthday when I excitedly mentioned how I'd love a decent laptop, only to be told that money wasn't available because, well, you know how expensive things are for James. School was no better. James attended a top-tier private school on a full scholarship, one that our parents somehow managed to fund despite our modest means. I, on the other hand, was sent to the local public school and later to a state college, relying on scholarships and loans to get through. While I worked hard and earned every cent I received, James always seemed to float through life, expecting our parents to fix every financial mishap he encountered. And here's the kicker. Whenever James ran into money troubles, which was often, my parents would swoop in to bail him out. I later learned he'd made several poor investment decisions and even started a couple of business ventures that collapsed spectacularly. Each time, my parents found a way to cover his losses. They'd call it support or family help, but to me it felt like they were literally stealing from me. When I was a kid, my dad set up a modest inheritance fund for each of us. It wasn't a fortune, about $50,000 each, but it was meant to help us start our adult lives on a solid footing. I always believed that when I turned 25, I'd finally receive the money I'd worked so hard for indirectly, as a safety net to help with college expenses, a down payment on a house, or starting a business. When I finally hit 25, I casually asked my mom about the fund. I still remember her tone, sweet and a bit too calm for the bombshell she was about to drop. She said, "Oh, honey, we had to use that money for James. You don't mind, do you?" I almost couldn't breathe. "You what? Mind? You took my money, my inheritance, and gave it all to James?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. Her response was chillingly nonchalant. "We thought you wouldn't need it as much. You've always been more responsible, and James, he needed help." Help, that's what they called it. But to me, it felt like they'd simply decided that my future wasn't worth the investment. I immediately called my dad. I needed some sort of explanation. He answered in a monotone, saying, "It was your mother's decision." That was it. No discussion, no remorse. I felt betrayed not only by my mom, who had always claimed to love me, but also by my dad, who'd let it happen without even a protest. I spent the next few days in a haze. I couldn't concentrate at work or even enjoy time with friends. Every time I thought about that phone call, the anger bubbled up inside me. I'd replay the conversation over and over in my head. My mom's nonchalant tone, my dad's dismissive, "It was your mother's decision," and the crushing realization that my future, my hard-earned future, had been snatched away without my consent. The moment that truly pushed me over the edge was when I confronted my parents. I remember storming into our family home, heart pounding, fists clenched, ready to demand answers. My mom was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a look that I now realize was a mix of guilt and defiance. I nearly shouted, "How could you do this to me? I trusted you!" Instead, I managed a shaky, "Why did you take my money and give it to James?" My voice trembled with both anger and hurt. My mom's eyes filled with tears as she replied, "James is your brother, Daniel. He's had a hard time and we needed to help him. You're doing fine, you're independent, and you'll understand someday. Understand? I shot back. I understand that I worked hard for my future, that I struggled to pay my own way through college while you squandered my inheritance on him. That's not family support, that's theft. My dad tried to interject, saying, Daniel, it's not like that. But his words were drowned out by my rising fury. I didn't want to hear excuses. I wanted accountability. I left the house that day in tears. I realized that my parents didn't see me as an equal. They saw me as an extra expense, a backup plan if James ever failed. And as much as I loved my family, I couldn't allow this injustice to go unchallenged. After that explosive confrontation, I spent weeks mulling over my next move. I wasn't interested in petty revenge in the traditional sense, like slapping my parents or burning their belongings. I wanted something that would force them to feel the same financial ruin and loss that I had experienced. That's when I started looking into our family's assets. My parents, despite their best efforts to be frugal, hadn't been great with money. The one substantial asset they still had was their house. It was fully paid off, a relic of their younger days and the symbol of everything they'd worked for. Their plan was to eventually sell the house, downsize, and use the proceeds for their retirement. I knew this was my opportunity. Around the same time, I reached out to my paternal grandmother, my dad's mom. Grandma had always been a voice of reason in our family. Unlike my parents, who had a penchant for favoritism, she treated both of us equally and always expressed her disapproval of how my parents managed our finances. I arranged a visit with her, and over a cup of coffee, I laid everything out. The inheritance fiasco, my parents' blatant favoritism toward James, and how it had left me feeling worthless. Grandma listened quietly, her eyes hardening as she absorbed every word. When I finished, she said, I always knew something was off. I've watched them drain everything for him and ignore you, thinking you're self-sufficient. I'm tired of it. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way to turn the tables without resorting to impulsive, emotional acts. Grandma confided that she had set aside some money for my parents, a retirement fund of sorts, but recently, she had made a change. I revised my will, she told me firmly, and I left the majority of my estate to you instead of your parents. I couldn't believe it. Grandma had finally given me something of real value, a statement that said, I see you and you matter. I thanked her, tears streaming down my face, and promised to use the money wisely to build the future that was rightfully mine. A year passed, and eventually my grandmother passed away peacefully. Soon after, the revised will became known to the rest of the family. My parents were devastated. I remember the phone call from my mom vividly. Her voice was shrill with anger, and she barely managed to get out, How could you do this? You manipulated Grandma. I tried to keep my tone calm, though inside I was boiling. I didn't manipulate anyone. Grandma made her own decision after years of watching you favor James at my expense. It's time I got what's mine. My dad's response was subdued but hurt. Daniel, we did everything for you too. You're forgetting how much we sacrificed. Sacrificed? I thought bitterly. What they sacrificed was my future for the sake of one irresponsible son. That day, everything came crashing down. My mom, who had always been the mastermind behind our family's financial decisions, went into a downward spiral. She tried to justify her actions in every conversation, insisting that James needed support and that I was too stubborn to see the bigger picture. But as the reality of our financial ruin set in, forced by the loss of the retirement fund from Grandma's will, they had no answer for me. James, of course, was furious with me too. He had been relying on our parents' endless bailouts for so long that the sudden loss of financial support hit him like a freight train. He confronted me one evening at a family dinner, voice shaking with both anger and desperation. Daniel, why are you doing this to us? We're a family, and you're tearing us apart. I could only shake my head and reply, You tore us apart long ago when you made it clear that you were more important than I ever would be. The dinner ended in silence, with every relative staring at me, unsure of what to do next. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was dramatic. My parents were forced to sell their house much sooner than they had planned. The proceeds from the sale were meager compared to what they'd hoped to have for their retirement. Instead of a comfortable downsize, they ended up in a cramped apartment in a rundown part of town. My mom spent endless hours crying over the loss of everything, and my dad remained silent, his disappointment palpable. I, on the other hand, finally felt liberated. I used a portion of Grandma's estate to invest in my own future. I started a small business with the savings I'd long been denied, a modest but promising venture that allowed me to finally put my hard work to good use. The satisfaction wasn't just financial, it was emotional too. I had reclaimed control over my destiny. Word got around in our extended family. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and even some family friends started reaching out to me. Many of them had grown tired of the constant favoritism and the way my parents managed money. One of my aunts sent me a message saying, "Daniel, you've always been the one who kept it together. I'm glad you finally stand up for yourself." Others agreed, and soon I found that most of our relatives were on my side, finally recognizing the injustice that had been done for years. James eventually tried to apologize, claiming he'd realized how selfish he'd been. But I wasn't interested in empty apologies. I had my own path to follow now, and I wasn't going to let my brother or my parents derail my future. I made it clear in one final conversation with him. "I'm not here to save you, James. I'm here to live my life. If you want to change, do it on your own, but don't expect me to bail you out ever again." That conversation marked a turning point. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. I moved into a modest apartment, started investing in my business, and surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for a dysfunctional family. I even started volunteering at a local community center, helping others who had faced similar family betrayals. It was therapeutic. Sharing my story with strangers who understood the pain of being overlooked and taken advantage of helped me heal. I realized that sometimes the only way to break free from a toxic cycle was to build a new support network, one based on mutual respect and understanding rather than old loyalties and guilt. Looking back now, I see that my family's actions were never really about love or sacrifice. They were about control and favoritism. My parents, especially my mom, were so fixated on keeping the family together under their own terms that they completely disregarded my well-being. They used me as a fallback, a source of financial support if needed, while pampering James and enabling his reckless behavior. For years, I felt trapped by a sense of obligation, as if my future was not my own but something to be sacrificed on the altar of family duty. I resented that, and the pain only grew as I realized that my hard work and sacrifices were systematically ignored. The loss of my inheritance was not just a financial blow, it was a statement that I was less valuable than my brother. When my grandmother stepped in and changed her will, it wasn't just a legal document. It was a message that someone finally recognized my worth. It was the catalyst for me to reclaim my independence and build a life that wasn't dictated by my parents' twisted priorities. Today, I'm doing much better. My business is slowly growing, and while I'm not rich, I'm proud of the fact that I'm building my future on my own terms. I still get calls from my parents, mostly laden with guilt and regret. My mom, in particular, has had to face the reality that her choices have led to this fallout. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear her crying and apologizing over the phone, but I don't have the energy to rehash old wounds. I've learned to let go. One thing I've realized is that family doesn't always mean blood. True family is the people who stand by you when no one else will, who support you without expecting you to sacrifice your dreams. I've built a new family among my friends and community members who share similar values, and that has made all the difference. As for James, he's been trying to turn his life around. He's found a steady job now, and while our relationship is still strained, I can see that he's making efforts to be more responsible. I'm not holding a grudge forever. I'm simply moving on. But one thing is clear. I will never, ever let anyone treat me like a disposable asset again. In the end, what happened to me wasn't just a personal battle. It was a lesson in standing up for yourself, even when it means turning your back on the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. I'm sharing this not to boast or vent about my success, but to remind anyone who feels undervalued that it's possible to take control of your life, no matter how deep the betrayal. I still get mixed feelings when I think about it all. Part of me wonders if there was any way I could have handled the situation differently. More compassionately, maybe. But when someone steals what's rightfully yours, sometimes the only response is to force them to face the consequences of their actions. I'm not saying I wish pain on my parents or my brother. I just want them to understand that actions have consequences. I want them to realize that their decisions have left scars, and maybe, just maybe, they'll learn to treat people with a bit more fairness in the future. For me, this journey has been about reclaiming my identity. I've had to rebuild my trust in myself, and in the process, I discovered that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. I'm proud of the person I'm becoming, even if it meant losing a part of my old life along the way. I know some of you might be thinking, "That's harsh, Daniel." And you're right, it's harsh. But sometimes life is harsh, and if you're not willing to fight for what's yours, you'll end up with nothing. I'm not out for blood, but I'm definitely out for justice, and that justice has come in the form of a hard-won independence that I wouldn't trade for anything. Thanks for reading, Reddit. I know this story might sound extreme, but sometimes real life is brutal, and sometimes you have to fight back to survive. If any of you have been through something similar, or have any advice on moving forward with a fractured family, drop a comment. Let's share our stories and support each other in reclaiming what's rightfully ours.